A fair few online platforms have been called in before the US government recently, including Alphabet, owners of Google and YouTube. They were called in front of the Judiciary Committee, and they have delivered a rather interesting response to the array of allegations levied against them, largely focusing in on censorship and bias against or for individual users of their platform, depending upon their political stance. Now, the tweet right here says, due to the oversight's efforts, Google commits to offer all creators previously kicked off YouTube due to political speech violations to return to the platform. This is a bit of an overstatement of what exactly YouTube has been saying here. They've also mentioned that the Biden administration was indeed leaning on YouTube to remove speech that was not in violation of YouTube's terms of service. So instead of relying on the interpretation, shall we, I think it's worth having an actual look at the document in question here, because there are some good things and some promising things that are coming out of this, but, well, these platforms have been in front of the government before, and what usually happens is that they make a lot of noise, they say a lot of things, and then rarely, if ever, actually do any of those things. Though this is the furthest bent back I think I've seen YouTube in a very long time, so let's have a look here. The first interesting part is the Biden administration and Alphabet. The COVID-19 pandemic was an unprecedented time in which online platforms had to reach decisions about how to best balance freedom of expression with responsibility, including responsibility with respect to the moderation of user-generated content that could result in real-world harm. This, of course, is referring to the fact that YouTube was getting very, very aggressive with taking down information provided by non-authoritative sources, especially during the early months of COVID-19. Now, to be fair, there is absolutely an argument to be made that an online platform has the responsibility to limit the spread of panic or false cures, etc. during such a period. The problem is, however, that the people that they were taking the advice from, the authoritative sources, were just as bad, if not worse, in fact, due to their access to platforms and being trusted because of their access to those platforms, and have indeed changed most of their regulatory guidelines since. They didn't know what they were doing either, and so striking out the common man because they too didn't know what they were doing seems a pinch ridiculous in hindsight. But the interesting thing is, Biden administration officials, including White House officials, conducted repeated and sustained outreach to Alphabet and pressed the company, YouTube, regarding certain user-generated content related to the COVID-19 pandemic that did not violate its policies. Whilst the company continued to develop and enforce its policies independently, Biden administration officials continued to press the company to remove non-violative user-generated content. Now, this is the interesting part, along with it is unacceptable and wrong when any government, including the Biden administration, attempts to dictate how the company moderates content, and the company has consistently fought against those efforts on First Amendment grounds. Of course, YouTube did actually bow to demands for COVID censorship, as we now know, of course, but it is very interesting that they had official contact with the Biden administration, and that the Biden administration actively pushed for further regulatory guidelines and for YouTube to remove content that was not in violation of its terms of service, particularly considering the timing then of when the Biden administration was in power during COVID-19. In other words, even after YouTube had taken most of its major steps, Biden was still asking for further limitations on even content that was then non-violatory. An obvious demand for censorship, probably in all due likelihood along what we now know to be rather political lines. The, again, aforementioned authoritative sources, who was pulling shit just as far out of their rectum as everybody else was. They go on to talk about YouTube as well, and basically a long period of bragging about themselves, and to be fair, their stats are pretty impressive, but it then moves on to moderation approach and commitment to free expression. So now we know that YouTube has been censored and has actively been attempted to be censored and influenced. What is YouTube going to do about it? YouTube takes seriously the importance of protecting free expression and access to a range of viewpoints. Waffle waffle. YouTube's community guidelines and terms of service apply equally to all users. Bullshit. From private citizens to the most visible public figures, and to all types of content regardless of the views expressed. We know this to be false. We've known this to be false for a very long time, and we have countless ways to demonstrate it. Hell, one of the most recent examples came from everyone's favorite streamer, Destiny, who was demonetized on YouTube for shit that would have had literally any other person's channel yeeted off the internet, not merely of YouTube, but of social media in general. This is a person who have repeatedly and vociferously wished death upon his political opponents whilst displaying absolutely zero remorse for it, and yet he was still allowed to have a YouTube. Even now, he's just been demonetized, which, again, in my opinion, I do believe is the correct step, along with a serious de-ranking in the algorithm, but again, anyone else would simply not have an online presence anymore after this. And it's beautifully demonstrated by his own confusion. When he's like, oh, I've been demonetized. Oh, well, I don't know why. YouTube didn't really tell me. They didn't really give me a reason. Yes. Welcome to 2016! YouTube hasn't been giving out reasons for yeeting people off their platforms for the last goddamn 10 years plus, and everyone who's actually been victimized by YouTube's algorithm and its unequal treatment of people based expressly on political beliefs as well, knows this. But Destiny, who has been living in a very privileged bubble for a very, very long time, is completely and utterly unaware of this phenomenon. He has just woken up in the modern day thinking, what? All of the things I've argued for about speech having consequences to my opponents is now being applied to me? How very, very terrible. So this is mainly just YouTube doubling down on doing what they've always been doing. Although, there is an interesting little mention further down. YouTube values conservative voices on its platforms and recognize these creators have extensive reach and play an important role in the civic discourse. Interesting. It may simply just be lip service, entirely possible, but I do believe this is the first time YouTube has actually acknowledged that there are conservatives on the platform that aren't simply just terrorists. And it goes on also to talk about COVID, and it does indeed admit as well that relying on authoritative sources was potentially a mistake, as aforementioned authoritative sources have also repeatedly changed their own guidelines, demonstrating that they didn't know what they were doing either. No matter the political atmosphere, YouTube will continue to enable free expression on its platform, particularly as it relates to issues subject to political debate. Political debate and discussion are in the public's interest, which is why YouTube expands its approach to educate, documentary, scientific, and artist content on the platform. Right? That is a nice commitment, but not one that has really been seen coming forward, though there are a couple of interesting things in relation to that as well. In contrast to other large platforms, YouTube has not operated a fact-checking program that identifies and compensates fact-checking partners whose content support moderation. This is true, mostly because YouTube has simply just enforced its TOS as broadly as it wants and yeeted people off the platform rather than providing an opposite point of view. But it feeds into this. YouTube also began offering a feature on YouTube beginning in June 2024 that allows users to add notes to provide relevant, timely, and understandable context on videos. In essence, a Twitter fact-checking system, the community note, which I do believe to be a good idea. The community notes have proven to be a universally beneficial feature on Twitter, calling out left and right wing equally, and providing factual entertainment and, crucially as well, calling out scammers and false engagement-seeking behavior. The community note system if allowed, big if, to operate truly independently is a major blessing to social media platforms, and YouTube's commitment to rolling this feature out to more than 5 people is certainly welcomed, assuming again it will operate along the same lines as Twitter's. Now, the regulatory landscape is another interesting point right here. They do mention as well here, by the way, that they want to give a way back to content creators, but specifically, mind you, reflecting the company's commitment to free expression, YouTube will provide an opportunity for all creators to rejoin the platform if the company terminated their channels for repeated violation of COVID and election integrity policy that are no longer in effect. So it's not, as the tweets have said, all creators, no, only those who are banned for those specific 2 reasons may apply to be returned under the fact that those policies no longer apply. So again, not all, only those. And this comes as also in part of the regulatory landscape, as YouTube then talks about how it is being affected not just by the US, but by other regulatory bodies across the world as well, where there are other governments, like the European Union, for example, or the United Kingdom, who are also placing restrictions on YouTube with the demands that they censor certain content, and or rule in favor of them when it comes to biases, enforcing their own views while suppressing those of their opposition. YouTube goes a very long way to suggest that that is exactly what is being happening, and with the previous admissions that the Biden administration has already done so, it would not at all surprise me if bodies like the European Union haven't done so as well. This is probably the single greatest threat to online freedom of speech right now. The United States has demonstrated a laudable commitment to the values of free speech, even if I do see some movements on the right wing as well to utilize the weapons of the enemy a bit more actively, which it's one of those things where at the moment I have no problems whatsoever with the right making an example of a significant number of their enemies to teach them a lesson, as it appears to have been the only lesson that have actually sunk in the last decade plus, but there is always the risk of regulatory overreach. When it comes to the European Union and the United Kingdom, however, these are active political entities with an active and clearly stated ideological position that will have and are censoring along political lines. No matter how flawed you may think that the United States could become, the United Kingdom and the EU are already there and have been there for a very long time. What YouTube is kind of hinting at here is some sort of a regulatory framework that protects it against foreign powers, which I believe, by the way, is entirely reasonable. If YouTube is willing to move its assets back to the United States, which must obviously be a prerequisite, then the United States government should protect them by saying, okay, you fined Google for not removing something, right? Let's check if it violates any of our rules and regulations. If not, we are simply going to decide that your fine is non-enforceable. Fuck you. Entirely fine and fair. And if these guidelines are simply along political lines, as in non-politics, as in freedom of speech, as in the proper values of the First Amendment, then I see nothing wrong with it. And if the European Union and the United Kingdom, etc., then would like to instead choose to cut themselves off from the internet in total, well, you're a fucking head, I suppose. We saw how well that worked for Nepal. Even if they were to threaten to do so, or will block access to Facebook, Twitter, etc., so long as all of these companies come together under a shared protective system by the US, so that if you want to block one of them, you'll block all of them, there is simply no way it will happen. The European Union, England, etc. will not risk the backlash of, in essence, wiping out social media for its population. It would be the end of virtually every single government in the European Union if they tried to do so. It would be a historically unpopular move. Especially considering the only alternative would be official governmental ones. But again, that does need to be something put in place, probably by the United States, preferably in conjunction with the rest of the Western powers, as a cooperative agreement, but, well, again, the problem with censorship is that it is a very, very effective tool that once used, and once one realizes just how good it is very difficult to let go of. This is what all of the powers that be have by now noticed, and the primary beneficiaries of aforementioned censorship, well, they never see anything wrong with it whatsoever. They will only begin lamenting it once it creeps over to their backyard, as it usually rather inevitably does. I will also point out, by the way, that YouTube has merely committed itself to bringing back the content creators in violation of those two aforementioned no longer existing policies. This doesn't give a timeline, it doesn't commit YouTube to doing it now or next week or next month or next year or anything. It is merely that they will begin the process, which means they'll hire in one person with precisely zero qualifications other than being the company janitor to begin working out the legislative measures and internal TOS changes to begin doing this, so don't hold your breath. The only reason why Twitter managed to back on board so many individuals after Elon bought it was because there was a genuine will and an effort and a way to do so. I'm not entirely convinced that YouTube is anywhere near as interested in bringing back the people it yeeted off its platforms. Now, what should also then of course be applied is for them to commit themselves more fully to the actual equal treatment of its creators. Something that, and to be fair, they have taken at least a step in that direction with the demonetization of Destiny, but as I've said previously, so long as Hassan Piker has a YouTube channel, so long as Vorsh has a YouTube channel, these outspoken individuals in favor of political violence and many other heinous things, so long as they're allowed on YouTube, we already know that the double standard is truly and well indeed alive. So, for now, a lot of empty words, with some interesting little revelations and some theoretical future commitments, but until I see real movement by YouTube, it's probably just more hot air, if I'm to be honest. Still, a victory is a victory, and if nothing else, it does demonstrate that the Biden regime engaged in censorship already too, even if merely so-called voluntary censorship, as voluntary as any interaction with the government can ever be. Do let me know what you think in the comment section down below on this, and whether or not it makes you more optimistic for the future, or if you more or less share my idea that until we actually see some action, all of this is merely just a maneuver to placate the committee in question. Till next time, I've been Arch, thank you all very much for watching, and do hope to see you all again soon. Till then, have a good day.